Here we're going to look at VLAN trunking protocol, or VTP. The purpose of VTP is to propagate the VLAN database information to all the switches. So if you have multiple switches that need the same VLAN information, you can configure VTP on each of the switches. That way, whenever you add, delete, or modify a VLAN, you'll do it on the VTP server, which I'll talk about in a second. That will get propagated out to all the other switches that are in that VTP domain. In order to belong to a domain, each of the switch they have to have the same domain name and the same VTP version. If you configure passwords, which are optional, then those must match also. So to be in the same domain, they have to have the same domain name and the same VTP version. And if you configure passwords, then those have to match also. A switch can be in one of four modes. In server mode, which is the default, so by default when you take them out of the box or whatever, and you go to configure, they'll be in VTP server mode. In server mode, that's where you can add, modify, or delete VLANs. So that's where I can make all my VLAN changes, and then that information will propagate out to the rest of the switches within the domain. Clients, in client mode, you can't modify VLANs, you can't add them, you can't delete them. It just takes the information from the server that's advertised out and updates its VLAN database accordingly. Okay? In transparent mode, the switch doesn't participate in VTP, but it will forward VTP advertisements. It just won't use them to update its own VLAN database. And remember, the VLAN database is saved in Flash. That's that VLAN.dat file. It's not saved in your running config or in NVRAM. It's saved in Flash. And lastly, I forgot one thing. In transparent mode, if you use version 1 of VTP, the switches have to be in the same domain. So the transparent switch has to be in the same domain as the other switches that it's going to propagate out to in order for it to propagate. Otherwise, it won't propagate or won't forward that VTP information. In version 2 doesn't care. If the VTP advertisement comes in and it's not in the same domain, that's fine. And then last, we can be in off mode, which means it doesn't participate in VTP at all. It won't forward the VTP advertisements. You would go into off mode, say for example, if you had a switch that was connected, like you had a link connected to a server, it was a trunk link, which is pretty common. You trunk to your servers, right? But there's no need for that server to get those VTP advertisements because it's a server at the other end. So you go in off mode for that interface, and therefore it doesn't, there's no need for that to participate in VTP or forward those advertisements. There are 3 messages VTP uses in order to update and stay synchronized, right? The summary advertisement is sent out every 5 minutes or when you make a VLAN change. In the summary advertisement is the domain and the revision numbers. So when a switch receives a summary advertisement, it checks the domain. If it's in the same domain, then it looks at the revision number. Okay, the revision number is used for a switch to decide whether or not it should update its VLAN database. If the revision number in the advertisement is higher than the one that the switch has, that signals to the switch that a change has been made and the switch needs to update its database. Okay? So then the switch will send an advertisement request. Okay? An advertisement request is sent from a client to request VLAN information. So if a client is missing any VLAN information, it can go ahead and send an advertisement request. For example, if the domain name has changed or the switch has been reset, it can send an advertisement request. Then the server will respond with a summary advertisement and a subset advertisement. A subset advertisement is created and sent out it should say by, created and sent out by the server when a VLAN has been modified, added, or deleted. Okay, so we make a change, a summary advertisement is sent out that contains the domain name and the revision number, and then following that summary advertisement is a subset advertisement which will have the VLAN information in it. Right? More than one subset advertisement may need to be sent out. Then we have 3 versions of VTP. Version 1 is the default version. In version 2, we added the ability to forward VTP advertisements regardless of the domain, so we talked about that earlier. Support for token ring, and it will propagate an unrecognized VTP message. Oh, and the consistency check. So when information is entered into CLI or through SNMP, it will check. And then, so it will do a consistency check to make sure the VLANs are the same and whatnot. With VTP version 2, when the domain name is null, so like take it out of the box or factory defaults or whatever, if the switch receives a VTP advertisement with a domain name, the switch will actually change to that domain name. Okay. With version 3, we added support for extended VLANs, MST, and much better security. For example, in the previous part where VTP version 2 would change its domain from null to whatever it got an advertisement for, version 3 won't do that. It won't automatically change its domain. The other cool thing is that VLAN changes can only be made on the primary server, and you actually have to use a password to kind of get into that. You have to switch into it, and it checks to see if there are any other primaries before it switches. And we'll look at that more when we configure it. I would venture to guess, VTP, version 2 is still the most widely used, but 3 has some added features that are pretty nice. And so we'll go through those in our configuration. 2 other things with VTP, we can do authentication, so we can add passwords. We said that was optional before. And we'll just add a little bit of security. It's not a lot. MD5 is relatively easy to crack, as we know, but we can uses MD5, and it can be up to 64 characters. The other thing VTP can do is we can enable VTP pruning. So remember back when we discussed VLANs and manually pruning VLANs over a trunk with the switch port allow command? Here with VTP, if we're using VTP, we can enter the term VTP pruning, and it will automatically restrict VLAN traffic on links where the VLANs aren't being used. So I'll go through that example, but we had done that back when we looked at trunking. We did the manually allowed, added, allowed, removed VLANs. Here, VTP pruning will automatically see whether or not that VLAN is needed or it's being used over on the switch, and then it can automatically restrict that traffic. So if we go ahead and look at the configuration, it's pretty straightforward. Go into a switch, you do the VTP domain and the domain name. We do VTP version. We have obviously choice 1, 2, or 3. And then we tell the switch whether, what mode is it running in. Server, client, transparent. I should have off there. Off is an option. And then again, remember the optional password. This is there's a couple different things we'll need to do with VTP version 3. And I'll show you that when we do the configuration. So I think next, let's go ahead and do a VTP configuration. We'll do our configuration on our switch 1 and switch 2. So if we go down to our topology, again, our same host and our 2 switches. And I think this time what I'll do is I will go back, clear out all the VLANs we'd already created, so it's real obvious to us whenever we make a change. We'll only have a few VLANs. Clean up all this stuff. Leave the trunks there. VTP requires trunks, right? VLAN trunking protocol. So if VTP is not propagating information, and you think your other stuff is set right, passwords match, they're in the same domain, then what you want to do is make sure that there's a trunk link that's actually up between those 2 switches. So I'm going to go ahead and start with switch 1. I'm going to get rid of the VLANs first that I configured previously. So remember, I can't delete 1, so we'll just go 2 to, I think the top level that I've configured here before was 30, so we'll get rid of those VLANs. And if we do a show VLAN brief, whoops, spell brief correctly, the start of it at least. Now we have all our default. We have our default VLAN 1 and then our FTDI and token ring. So we're good. I'm going to go over to switch 2 and do the same thing. All right, we look good, right? Let's do a show VTP status. It's capable of running 1 to 3. It's running the default version 1. There's no domain name, right? This is what we would call the null, or null file. This would be what we call the null domain. And it's operating in server mode, which is the default. Okay, so there's just a couple things we're looking for. We look for default VTP version is 1, and the default mode is server. Let's go back to switch 1 and do the same thing. Show VTP status. I'm going to get rid of login console. Never mind. And we should see the same thing. 1, our default, servers are default. Remember I talked earlier about that revision number? Right now the revision number here is at 4. Let's see what 2's was. You remember that? And that's just carryover from, because it would normally be, it wouldn't be this high. We just started out. But this is, one in a series of videos where I've kind of just kept working with the same topology. So we've added and deleted VLANs. And so every time we do that, that configuration revision number gets incremented. So just out of curiosity, let's see what switch 2 is at right now. Show VTP status, and it's at 3. So what will be interesting is if I keep switch 1 as the server, we get them both in the same domain. As soon as the summary advertisement is sent out, and this switch 2 sees it, and it sees that revision number and the domain name in there, it'll go ahead and update its VLAN database. So that's kind of nice. All right, let's get to configuring VTP. Now remember, it's by default in server mode, so I don't necessarily have to straight out configure it, but I'm going to. So I make switch 1 the server and switch 2 the client. Right, it'll tell me, that's already the mode it's in, that's fine. VTP, domain, my domain. You could name, obviously, something probably useful for your network. I'm just naming it my domain. So it told me now it went from null to my domain. Let's give it a password. I'm going to go with VTP pass. Nah, I better go with test pass. So that way I won't forget it. I want to make sure it's something I won't suddenly in the middle of this demonstration forget. So give it a password. Right, and by default it's version 1, so we're going to configure version 2. We like some of the enhancements. To me, in my personal opinion, if all my switches were VTP version 3 capable, and not all switches are, I would go with version 3 right now. Right now I'm demonstrating VTP version 2. I will go back through and demonstrate version 3. Oops. Let's do a show. All right, so I'm going to get rid of this console logging. I don't like it. Oh. No logging console. We'll get rid of some of that. Now let's do a show. Let's exit back. Wow, can't even spell. Show VTP status again. And now we see that we're using version 2. The domain that this switch is in is my domain. I don't have pruning enabled yet. Right, we'll do that. It's server. And now also because I've made a change, the revision number's up. So let's go ahead, and now we've got to configure switch 2 so that it's also in the VTP domain. VTP domain, my domain. And remember, this is why you're getting this, I'm just doing it specifically, is the issue with versions previous to 3, obviously, is that if the domain is set to null, when it gets an advertisement where it sees a domain name, it picks it up. So it did that while we were working. It said the domain name is already set to my domain. VTP password is what? Test pass, right? And VTP version is 2. And then VTP mode will be client. So it changed it. We'll do a show VTP status. Okay, it's got its update. Their configuration revision numbers are the same. Now let's go back through and make a change and add a VLAN to switch 1. Wait, let's not do that. Let's first show our VLANs. Show VLAN. Right, just our default VLANs and our FDDI and token ring. Now let's go and show how VTP works. So let's add 10, 20, and 30. Then look at our VLANs. So we have 1, 10, 20, and 30 here. If we go over to switch 2, we should have 1 or 10, 20, and 30 over there. I just decided, I keep using brief, so I decided to go ahead and use something else. So we just did a show VLAN, and in fact we do have 10, 20, and 30, and we didn't configure it. So that's how VTP works. Probably most likely only going to be used when you have end-to-end VLANs. Otherwise you probably don't have that many. You only have so many switches in a switch block, so many that are going to be connected, probably within the same building. It might not be that useful for just a few switches to configure VTP, but that's how VTP works. Notice too that I didn't change the configuration, so let me think. So our gig 3 should still be in VLAN 10 from the earlier configuration, right? When we went on and we had our topology, right? And I had put was it host 1 and host 3 in VLAN 10. Whoops, it's not very good. 0. There we go. I didn't take that out. I'd only taken out the VLANs earlier, so we could see easily that they propagate. We didn't have to look through a bunch of VLANs. So that should still be there. So if I do a show run, I think it'd begin at 0.3. That should bring me to, no, there we go. Gig 0.3. Oh, I moved too much. And it's still in VLAN 10. So none of that changed. Now notice nothing else would be in any of those VLANs we created, because the only thing VTP does is propagate that VLAN information. It doesn't change your running config such that it would provide access to a particular one of those VLANs. All right, the other thing, remember, we can do is configure VTP pruning. Whoops, made a mistake. Well, that's a good mistake. I just didn't realize what switch I was on. Can't modify pruning unless in VTP server mode, right? The server's the only one that can do anything. Now we'll go ahead and do VTP pruning. Now let's do it in configuration mode. There you go. And then it says it's on. Show VTP status. We should then see that pruning is enabled also. Okay, now let's go ahead and switch over and look at how VTP version 3 is just a little bit different in the way we are going to work with it or configure VLANs. So we'll leave our domain name and everything the same. We're just going to switch to version 3. VTP version 3. Okay. One of the things we can do differently is we can create a hidden password. Like I said, remember, a little more security. It ensures the password isn't saved in the configuration in clear text. So we can do VTP password, test pass, and then keyword hidden. So then it won't be saved in clear text. Okay. Now if we do a show show VTP password, that's what my password looks like. Okay, if it wasn't hidden, I'd see the password in there. And so that's just one feature of version 3. Okay, let's go over to switch 2. I'm sorry, yeah, go over to switch 2, I forgot. And do the same thing, right? Change the password, change the version. VTP version 3, VTP password, test pass. Well, you know what? Real quick, let's do a do show VTP password. I realized I hadn't shown you this in the last one, so I wanted to show you that I wasn't lying. By default, it'll be right in clear text. See it when I do a show VTP password. Now, if I do a VTP password test pass hidden, and then I up arrow do a show VTP password, now you don't see it in clear text. So you know that. So let's go ahead. We'll show you something a little different. We're going to go ahead and configure a VLAN over in switch 1 now that we're having now that we have version 3 running, to see how that's a little different. All right. So let's configure, we've configured 10, 20, and 30. Let's configure VLAN 50 now. Notice that VLAN configuration is not allowed when the device is not the primary server for the VLAN. So with VTP, you can have multiple VTP servers in your switched infrastructure or in that domain. But with version 3, it makes sure that you can only make changes on the primary server. Okay? So let's go ahead and make this switch VTP primary, which is kind of a little bit different. You're actually going to do that in privilege exec mode. So you do VTP primary. It'll ask for the VTP password. That's the one we configured, so it's test pass. And now what it's doing is looking, hopefully assuming I put my password in right, it's checking all the other switches it's connected to, or all the other switches it thinks is in the infrastructure, to see if any of the other ones are the primary server. It discovers that it has no conflicting devices, so do you want to continue? And I hit enter. Now I can go ahead and configure my VLAN, and it will work. See? So it's just a little bit of added security in VTP with version 3. So if we do a show VTP status, and we see that this switch is the primary server. Right? Another way to tell that is this says, okay, who's the primary? What's the ID of the primary? The primary ID is the same as the device ID. Okay. Description, switch 1. Okay. All right, so that's that's really how it's different. The other thing it will do, other thing version 3 does, other than the security, is it does have support for propagating extended VLANs. So I could create VLAN 4000, right? And then that should get propagated out to switch 2. We'll just double check. Here. Let's say that host 3 is actually a server, connected to switch 2, there's no need for VTP advertisements to be propagated out this trunk link. Well, let's say it was a trunk link, so we'll make it a trunk link real quick. And then it would be propagated out. There's no need for that, and so then that would be the use case that you would do turn VTP off. All right, so let's first make that a trunk. Int j 0/3. Oh, forgot, the switch does both, right? So switch port, trunk, encapsulation, .1q, then switch port, mode trunk. Now we'll go ahead and we'll just shut VTP off on this link, or on this interface. No VTP. Done. All right. Now we're running in VTP version 3 in all our switches, and because our link connecting our server is a trunk link, because our network card on our server can handle trunks, right? We just go ahead and shut off because it's not a switch on the other side, so there's no need to have VTP advertisements be sent or received there. So I think that's it. If you have any questions, let me know.